Matachum. My name's Olivia Chilcote, and I am moderating this panel. I am Lisenio from the San Luis Band of Mission Indians, and I just want to thank Saquon for having us here, and also the Critical Mission Studies project. And I'm sorry, but I feel like a talk show host. This is like one of those like long. All right. I used to watch a lot of Price is Right growing up, so this is like a surreal moment for me. So the first presentation is entitled Reclaiming Homelands, Mapping Indigenous Place Names of North San Diego County. And the presenters, sorry, I had their names. Let me grab the names of everyone again. So the presenters for this are Amy Admire of the Rincon Band of Lisenio Indians, Amra Solomon from UC Santa Barbara, Esmeralda Salcedo of Rincon, Priscilla Ortiz of Rincon, and last but not least, Anthony Hurtado from Rincon as well.
Can folks hear us? Yeah. No? Okay.
I don't think the mics are on.
They're not on. Okay, we can just project our voices.
Yeah.
Can you use the microphones? They're just for me.
Okay.
There is no speaker in the room, yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Miss Lisette.
Should we do our introductions?
Uh-huh.
Yes. You want to start? Or?
No, go ahead.
Okay. It's good, Dash, everyone. My name is Amra Salomon, and I am an assistant professor of English at UC Santa Barbara. I'm also from the Otham community of Yuma, Arizona. We're not federally recognized. We lost our recognition in 1916. And also on my California side, I do have some connection to the missions. One of my ancestors, their family was Yaqui and Spanish, and we're part of the first group of kind of Yaqui and mixed folks who were brought up from Sonora to the San Gabriel mission. And then on the other side of my family, my great-great-grandmother, Maria, was baptized at San Luis Rey, and she was a traditional medicine woman and also a midwife and an herbalist. And we're not exactly sure her tribal origin, but she might have been from this region, or she might have been from Mexico. So I have a little bit of connection to the missions through my own heritage, but I've been really honored to be working with Amy for a long time to support the work of the Rincon Youth Storytellers and all of the amazing, amazing youth education work that she does at Rincon.
That we do. We do this together. Supuna. No tung Amy America, no Washnine, no Payomkowish, no Guam Joseph Morales, Della Kolb, and Marcella Mason. My name is Amy Admire. I'm from the Rincon Indian Reservation. My grandparents are Joseph Morales, Della Kolb, and Marcella Mason. And as Amr said, I am the director of the Rincon Youth Storytellers. We primarily, through storytelling, I come from a famous storyteller named Lucario Cuevas, known at Rincon as the blind storyteller. And I'm very grateful to call him family. And so through that storytelling, we do preservation of our language, history, stories, and these beautiful young people here are alum of that program, and I will let them introduce themselves.
Miriam Chotanam Notung Priscilla Non Washnai PE Pi Nation Noquam Patty Duro, Antoinette Duro, and John LaChapa. Hello everyone, my name is Priscilla Ortiz. I am from Rincon in the Ipai Nation of Santa Isabel. And my grandparents are Patty Duro, Antoinette Duro, and John LaChapa. And I'm really glad to be here today.
Miriam Notung Anthony Yika Non Washnai Pi Tan Atam Noquam Josephine Cole P. Gary Hurtado P. Mariana Norris. Hello everybody, my name's Anthony. I'm Payavankowicham from Rincon, and I'm also Tan Atam from Arizona. My grandparents are Josephine Cole, Gary Hurtado, and Mariana Norris. And I work with the Rincon Indian Education Center. I've been part of the Storytellers for a really long time. And I'm currently a student at UC San Diego. And yeah.
Yay. So,
Great. So we're going to go over a little bit of the project that we had through the Critical Mission Studies Initiative. We had a community-based grant, and it has changed over time because, of the COVID-19 pandemic really shifted what we could do in terms of the community-based research that we wanted. But I think folks here are familiar with the initiative of Critical Mission Studies, so we can go to the next slide. And we just also wanted to honor Dr. Frank as being our advisor for this project. So he's helped us resolve a lot of questions and strategize how to do a lot of things. So we really wanted to thank him for his collaboration with this project as well. And then we can move to the first map, which is the traditional territory. And I will let one of you explain.
Well, I guess also we should explain our project. We wanted to recall and share with our people the original village names and sites along what is now known as the 76. It's been known as the Mission Trail. I don't know if you want to show a picture of that, but if anyone knows where the 76 is, it runs from Camp Pendleton, what is now known as Camp Pendleton, to Palomar, Pa'au. And again, it's known as the Mission Trail, and it's actually the trail that our people would take. It's the main trail. There were other, means of getting back and forth, but this is our main trail that was turned into a highway that our people would walk every 6 months or so to gather acorns, right, in the fall, and then back again to the ocean. So there's a lot of history and a lot of stories along that route, and that helps us awaken our DNA to connect to these stories and these places, which in turn helps in our healing process. Because the ultimate goal for our program is healing for our Native and Indigenous young people and their families, and that they experience less trauma than we did. So all of our projects have that in mind. And the map she showed prior, sorry, for those of you who are not familiar, our homelands, the Payom-Cowichum homelands, also known as Lisenio, if you aren't familiar with the word Payom-Cowichum. But our Payom-Cowichum homelands are from San Luis Obispo down into Encinitas, and then from Camp Pendleton out to Palomar.
And just going over a little bit of the project as well, one of the things we wanted to do was push back on the way that popular history of the area is known. If you go to the missions that we know, as we've been discussing all morning, they tell a very biased point of view. But if you also go to any other historical sites in the region, they're going to emphasize the gold rush, they're going to emphasize settler history, or maybe the battles between the U.S. and Mexico during the U.S.-Mexico War. They're not going to tell the story of indigenous peoples of North San Diego County. And so part of the project of just beginning with reclaiming the names is that we also want to move this into advocacy to push for some educational signage, working with parks and sites so that they know the original story of the land. And that there are also many historical sites that are significant that people living in the region should know about from the Native perspective. So our original research plan, if you want to move to the slide titled that, was that we wanted to film oral histories with elders. We know that a lot of elders in the community have a lot of powerful stories that have been passed to them about the land and the places and the names. We wanted to do group visits with the youth to these sites to record stories, to take pictures of the site, to also record GPS pin data, and so we could make more intricate maps. And then we wanted to survey damage and see, which of these sites might be under threat of encroachment, where areas where, maybe we need to do some other work around protecting the site or, helping push back against some development projects that might impact it. And then we also wanted to do some archival training with a larger group of youth, and bring them to a variety of archives that hold the records of the Payom-Cowichum people. And we want to make those records accessible to the youth so the youth know where their history is. And kind of push on these organizations also to think about Indigenous data sovereignty and, making copies for the tribal nations so that Native people have copies of their own historical records as well. And then we also were thinking about gatherings with, other community members, bringing in other bands of Payankosham, collaborating with other local researchers, doing some community organizing and activism, particularly around like a lot of the racist names that we've been encountering in the area, and advocating for the removal or replacement of those names and bringing back the original place name. And then launching a website with a digital map and publishing a booklet that we wanted to try to encourage the missions to sell in their gift shop, of having actually the story from the perspective of Native youth on what the place is and what it means. But next slide. Unfortunately, the pandemic happened. So we had to really radically shift what we could do, given that, our elders were very vulnerable. And we couldn't include them in so many things. So the archives were closed. Some of them are still closed. It was not safe to visit elders or conduct large gatherings. Even coordinating visits virtually was difficult. And then, even if we ordered something online, it was slow to get to us. And we had to kind of focus on other immediate needs as well. So what we did was, and we'll talk about this more, we conducted a lot of online research. We tried to modify that to see what could we find online, what archives and digital materials are available online. We tried to order or borrow printed materials, and we purchased recording equipment, and kind of did some limited site visits. The youth had a couple meetings with elders that were outdoors. And we tried to ensure social distancing and mask and hygiene and all of that.
I wanted to show you our outdoors.
So if you go to the next slide, which is titled Current Results.
But if I can too,
Yes.
What did I just read? So we did utilize online resources. I think most of us do. But I think what's specific to our project is that we have elders and ancestors who had the foresight to leave us information. The blind storyteller, my great uncle Anthony and our uncle Lucario Cuevas, was one of the main informants, if you will, for Constance Dubois. And so we have a lot of his research, his stories that we now tell, that include a lot of our places and our spaces, right? And so this project allows us to connect to those stories in a larger way, right? Connecting more of the dots for us, because then we learn more about the language. The language contains descriptions of places, right? And it's just really impactful in that way. We also have a elder, Violana Hyde, who's an auntie of many of ours, and she has a biography, and she's also instrumental in our dictionary. So those things are really instrumental in this kind of work as well, and we're just very grateful to them, and we feel that they are speaking to us in these ways, and so that also is a very healing element or tool for us to think of our ancestors speaking to us in this way. And this project gives us and affords us the time, which I felt really bad about in the pandemic. We had wanted to put more time into it and really have the young people dive in hands-on, right? And then we all had to shift gears for survival, right? We're in a period of survival strategy, as our ancestors have been. But yes, we had been looking forward to that time to really connect with the material and the work and the places, but we will get there.
And we did do a lot of connecting already. Like Miss Amy said, is Anthony and I actually got to read the work of Constance Dubois, which is actually where Miss Amy created most of our storytelling stories, right? You created the narrative from them?
That's where so they're based on Lucario's testimony to Constance Dubois. So, and I think someone mentioned it in the previous lecture or panel, but those are very instrumental resources for our people. And then, you know, there's other resources too. And so you can see different versions of things like our creation story that also name our places, right? And we've studied 2 creation stories during the time of this project as well. And so again, it's just been a really good resource for us to build our knowledge base. And what else?
Oh, and I just wanted to go off of that, just saying that looking through these works, I guess, or the recorded history gave Anthony and I a new look into like our own tribal history, because we grew up off of what Miss Amy has taught us, which was just our children's books and our language, you know, and our cultural history, but not the actual relationship history between our people and the mission people. Like, those were always separate things. So for us to learn about it, it wasn't as like devastating as we thought it would be. It was actually a little bit more empowering, knowing that, like Miss Amy said, our people had the foresight to record this history and to make connections with non-Native people at that time to save our history for us, because now we get to go back and do the work that they probably saw, you know, or imagined. So just for me, it's really empowering to know that I can help my ancestors do the work that they started a long time ago, and to put it into to a website. So like our whole project is actually gathering all this information and putting it onto a website that educators and students can visit, so that they know the unbiased history of it. And Amar's going to talk more about that because she put it together and it looks really good. But I do just want to say I had a lot of fun. And then I do want to give a shout out to Mr. Willie Pink. He was the one elder that we've been working with the most. We kind of chose him as the one that we'll be in contact with. Since we couldn't be in contact with a lot of elders, we wanted to be with him because he knows a lot about the place name or the place sites and the plants that go along with them. So, you know, just shouts to him.
We're grateful that he was healthy enough to feel like he could support us in this work. Yes. And Ms. Priscilla mentioned connecting us to our places. This work allows us to see also how we migrated, right? Not the word migrate is challenging, but eventually we had to move from, like, say, our place at Oceanside into the mountain. But it shows our people connection, right? Because a lot of times in the work we do with our young people, they engage in violence based on where they live, right? Mm-hmm. So based on the reservation system. So a lot of our young people don't realize that we are all family, mm-hmm. right? And there's that relationship, again, that 76 shows that relationship that we had with all of our tribal communities, amongst our different villages. We married people along the way. My grandfather was from Topame at Oceanside and married a woman at Yapicha, so it's very romantic sometimes to think of our people going along this route and finding each other. Right? So it allows us and it allows the young people to be more articulate about how our families got to where our families are, and then just trying to remind the young people that it's not about what reservation you're from, but to really concentrate on our journey of how we got to where we are, and then reconnecting with our family. So.
And just, I know we're pressed for time, so just briefly, the youth were able to go out with Mr. Pink and look at some sites along that route. You know, the route that was occupied by the missions was originally, as Amy said, you know, the travel route that people use throughout the year to connect to each other and to gather food and to go to calendar sites. So the youth were able to see one of these calendar sites in the rocks and learn about astronomy and the seasons. And they were also able to gather plants. And I don't know, maybe Anthony, if you want to talk about this a little briefly.
Yeah, so just the whole project and what we've been doing so far has been very educational and has added on to the knowledge that we've learned as youth and that we're learning now. Yeah, I mean, kind of losing train of thought, but
That's okay, Anthony.
yeah, for me, just personally, getting to learn all these things was really eye-opening, and it's a shame that a lot of this knowledge is severely forgotten about and not taught anywhere. And the fact of knowing that it could easily be implemented into local school systems so people can, or youth can learn more about the history of where they currently live, can be very crucial in them learning about how things came to be the way they are and why certain relationships are how they are now, between certain entities and things like that. But yeah, I don't have much else right now.
Thank you, Anthony.
We'll come to more. So if we can skip ahead to the slide that says APIS family history. Maybe Amy, you can talk real briefly about this, but one of the things that was discovered in the research was, particular histories of resilience and, indigenous brilliance of folks who were fighting to keep their land, different things that elders who and ancestors who are connected to the people's families today did.
Yes, so again, along the trail, we find stories of our ancestors. And Miss Priscilla put this together. I don't know if you want to talk about it, but this family was one of the families that did get one of the land grants after the secularization of the missions. He was the senior, Pablo Apis, had a store or an area, not particularly a store at that time, but he was along the trade routes, right? And so people would stop and trade with him. And he was one of those gathering areas. But I think where it says Indigenous women's resilience, one of, I believe, his daughters or granddaughters, there's an empowering story about her and how she survived. We talk about survival strategies. She was married young and went from husband to husband and had a lot of children. And she passed like my grandma did early, I believe, under the age of 35. And but just to see her survive, I guess, whether it is going from husband to husband. But she was known as someone who really took care of her children and just really, I found strength in her story.
When we were reading about it, it said that I think it was her grandfather that had the land. And back then, women couldn't own land. So when she found out that her grandpa was dying, she went and married somebody so that man could inherit the land from her grandfather. And then I think somewhere in there, the husband that she had married to get that land was trying to use it for something else. Or it's been a minute since we've looked at the story, but it was very empowering because she went through a lot of different channels and, paperwork to technically own that land. So she did a lot of I don't know, I guess indigenous resistance before it was a thing, to keep her land. So it was just a really interesting story, and that's going to be something that we highlight within our timeline. So it's history like that we want to bring forward and share with our children instead of just the regular old mission history that we've been told. We want like in-depth personal stories with our people.
And then if we could skip ahead to the slide that's the history of Chahuka. Forward. I think skip one slide and then it should be the history of Chahuka.
Yeah, if we're like going over, tell us.
Yeah.
Just like a couple more minutes.
Okay, yeah, we're going to try to run through some of the elements of the map and the research really quickly.
Yeah, so part of what we've been learning about is the history of Chahuka, who, as far as we know, is kind of like a spirit entity, an ancestor who lived on Palomar and was part of the races of this ancient ceremony known as the Notush ceremony, which was a ceremony where we'd all come together and participate in competitions with one another. And we actually have a children's story called The Contest Between the Ocean People and the Mountain People. And Chahoka is mentioned in the story and how he gave out in the race. And where he gave out in the race, you could actually see his footprint on a rock where he kind of stopped in the race. And one day we were walking up the trail behind Rincon, and we seen this rock with this kind of indentation, and we believe that is Chahoka's footprint, which is just between Rincon and La Jolla, kind of this ancient trail that people would cross to go from between those two areas. And so yeah, that's just one example of the history and the knowledge that's being obtained, and kind of connecting back to resources that many people are aware of. And so yeah.
And I just want to say, these young people have been telling the story since they were in 3rd grade. And so, like, the more we can build on the story, the more it awakens their DNA and our DNA. And then the more they can share back with their siblings and cousins. And so it's really wonderful to watch and to know that they're building on this knowledge and that they're going to keep passing it forward.
So, and also to mark too with some of these stories that this is what the mission system occupied, was these sacred ceremonial spaces that were already there and already significant to the people. And so if we can skip forward a couple slides to the, skip 2 slides, and then we'll be at Confronting Racism. So, in the process too, we were looking at names that are around the youth. Like, this is a park right across the street from the high school, and Native kids have to be confronted with, these monuments celebrating colonizers. And so that's one thing we wanted to note as well, how the process of naming and renaming has been embedded in this kind of colonial project of erasing the Native history. And so the next steps, we're continuing our research, and there's a lot of things that we want to do if we can find more funding, but we can jump to the website now. So this is what we have just published, and this is our draft website. We're using a program called ArcGIS Story Maps, because we're going to start embedding a lot more map and cartographic data. But if you kind of scroll down, we've got a couple different sections. If you go to the
Mi'u
Mi'amwa, you'll see there's a video of the Rincon storytellers singing a song, and then there's an explanation of it, and then we have curriculum ideas. And so this is designed as a curriculum that could be used in the region for, we don't want to hear from teachers anymore that they're not telling the story of Native kids because they don't have any curriculum. We're like, here's some curriculum. We've done it for you. There's activities, it's here. So we're trying to find ways to push back on that erasure so kids learn this as well. And if you go down further, then we put in the map of the place names and explained a little bit of the history of why it's important to reclaim this history from the Native perspective, how the youth created it. We've got a list of place names and their meanings. And then we've also got more curriculum ideas. And so over the next 2 or 3 months, we're going to be adding all of the research in. So probably every week or so, there's going to be a new piece that pops up on the website with more curriculum ideas tied to the research that Amy and the youth have done. And then we will also be launching this through PBS's Educator Toolkit too. So they've done an article, they're waiting for the website to be done. So now they're going to probably print that article, and it will go out to teachers who sign up on the PBS Educators newsletter. So we're trying to figure out how to reach teachers, how to get the curriculum now into the schools. So this is part of our project, and it's ongoing.
Thank you.
And if I could just add, because I do, for our young people, as far as the healing component, a lot of our reservation children live within cattle guards, and our children don't feel comfortable outside of those cattle guards. And what we really want them to do is feel comfortable and recognize that these are all their homelands. The Payomka Wichum, the Kuia, the Kupeño, right? The Kumiai, and we are all relatives, and we should feel comfortable wherever we are, and connecting them to their original village names, and just, again, reawakening that for them, because we want them to be more comfortable on their own home. So thank you.
So our next presentation is by Abel Gomez, and the title is We Survived This, Ohlone Narratives of Colonialism and Belonging at Mission Dolores.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to the Sikyan Band and to the organizers of the California the Critical Mission Studies for the invitation to be with you all today. On June 19th, 2020, activists toppled the statue of Father Junipero Serra at Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, the traditional territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. So you can go to the next slide, please. This and other removals of Serra statues across California came in the wake of the killings of George Floyd, Tony McDade, and other Black people at the hands of police. Black Lives Matter activists inspired a nationwide reckoning with the ongoing impacts of white supremacy. In California, this reignited controversy over the devastating impacts of the California missions for Native peoples, which included massive death, physical abuse, and sexual violence. Serra founded the California mission system, which eventually spread from San Diego to Sonoma. The Catholic Church formally canonized Serra as a saint in 2015, despite strong opposition by many in California Native communities. For many in Native California, Serra's canonization was viewed as a legitimation of the horrific violence that took place, the lasting impacts of which include cultural loss, land dispossession, and lack of federal recognition as Indian tribes, as felt by many tribal communities in the San Francisco Bay and across much of coastal California. Next slide, please. San Francisco was named after the local mission, San Francisco de Asís, though often referred to as Mission Dolores, because of the Arroyo de Nuestra Señora de los Dolores, which once flowed nearby. It was also the site of multiple protests opposing sainthood, such as one on May 2nd, 2015, part of the International Day of Mourning. The protest drew Native people and non-Native allies, including several Ohlone participants, such as Karina Gould of the Confederated Villages of Lashan, Ruth Orta, who's Himren Ohlone, Bay Miwok and Plains Miwok, and Wichapaluta Candelaria, who is Rumsen Ohlone and Apache. Vincent Medina, who is Chichenyo Ohlone, and his partner Vincent Trevino, who is Rumsen Ohlone, watched the scene from the mission balcony, where a sign reading "Natives Lives Matter" was hung. Karina's words were emblematic of the sentiments of those gathered. Quote, "My ancestors were directly enslaved at Mission Dolores here and at Mission San Jose in Fremont. I want to make sure that the Vatican knows that we and Native people allies do not agree with the canonization of Junipero Serra." End quote. Next slide. The perspective that California missions were sites of violence is a common theme among many Ohlone and California Native peoples. My fieldwork and interviews with several Ohlone communities also suggest there's an entire spectrum for how and what these sites mean. While California missions were arguably the single most destructive force for their ancestors, many of the people I interviewed also describe these sites as fundamentally indigenous places. In this paper, I argue we can understand Ohlone relations to these places by viewing them to various degrees as indigenous churches, cemeteries, or a combination of the two. The missions are indigenous places where the human world meets the unseen, whether that is defined as the Christian God and or ancestral spirits, even as they are also sites of violence, as places built by Indigenous peoples on Indigenous territories where they prayed and were buried. These are also sites of enduring meaning for many people. Considering the ways Ohlone peoples remap these places as Indigenous sacred sites also invites non-Ohlone peoples to consider relationships Ohlone people maintain to their lands before contact and narratives of survival into the future. Indeed, an engagement of these narratives has transformed the way I understand the place I call home. I was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, Ohlone Homelands. My mother, born of immigrant parents from Nicaragua and El Salvador, was also raised there, and she was actually baptized at Mission Dolores, as were several of my relatives. My father, an immigrant from Mexico, spent most of his time in the Bay Area. I'm the product of the 4th grade missions unit, during which students build dioramas of the missions and learn about the allegedly great deeds of the Spanish for California Indians. Indigenous peoples largely disappear from the curriculum beyond that point. Meeting an Ohlone elder during the last year of my undergraduate degree at San Francisco State shifted my perspective. Ohlone histories and revitalization became the focus of my graduate research. Historical research, ethnographic fieldwork, and relationships with Ohlone peoples have shifted the way I came to understand Ohlone survival and relationships to their ancestral lands, including the areas of the Catholic Spanish missions. Despite the violence that occurred in these places, many of us in California, as I mentioned, myself included, were taught a sanitized version of the missions, what historian Michelle Marie Lorimer has called the California mission myth. This narrative recounts the allegedly heroic deeds of Spanish settlers and priests who established California and brought native peoples to quote-unquote civilization. Erased from this mythology is the routine violence, obligatory religious instruction, and the thousands that died from Spanish diseases. Indigenous women were positioned as radically inferior, enduring sexual, psychological, and physical terror by soldiers and priests. Native peoples who did not fit into colonial gender binaries faced additional violence. Often called joyas, or jewels, by the Spanish, Ohlone Costanoan Esalen literary scholar Deborah Miranda argues that third gender people were subjected to beating, shaming, misgendering, and erasure in the mission system. We can perhaps trace the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirits in California to the denigration of Indigenous women and Two-Spirits within the California mission system. Next slide, please. California tribes pushed back against this mythology in powerful ways, including in events leading up to the canonization of Junípero Serra. Luis Miranda Ramirez, the chair of the Ohlone Costanoan Esalen Nation, was part of a ceremony and protest in opposition to Serra's canonization at Mission San Carlos in April 2015, a collaboration with the American Indian Movement, Idle No More, Costanoan Indian Research, Inc., along with participants from multiple tribes, including the Amamutsan tribal band. During the ceremony at the cemetery, Ramirez offered necklaces to ancestral graves. Quote, "We pray for our ancestors. We bring them necklaces and beads to show our love. We ask the Creator keep their sleep in peace." End quote. Miranda's ritualized actions were simultaneously a rejection of the colonial narrative of the missions as a benevolent place, but also point to something more. While the mission was a site of violence, it's also a cemetery for her ancestors, an important religious and cultural touchstone. Ramirez's words and actions connect to an important theme in my fieldwork, that for some, the missions are ancestral Indigenous sacred places. In addition to profound violence and death, it's important to note that religious conversion, ongoing religious practice in the mission, and various ways in which conversion protected or perhaps allowed cultural continuity generate relationships that Ohlone and other descendants of missions continue to have to these places. Missions continue to play an important role in contemporary Ohlone identities. Today, tribal membership is often based on ancestry to mission records. White anthropologists assigned Indigenous names to language groups connected to the missions. The names are visible in several of the contemporary organizations and tribes, such as the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, Ramaytush being connected to Mission Dolores, Costanoan Rumsen Carmel tribe, Rumsen being connected to San Carlos, Amamutsan tribal band, Mutsun being connected to San Juan Bautista, as well as individuals identifying as Mutsun Ohlone, as well as Chochenyo Ohlone, Chochenyo being connected to Mission San Jose. Next slide. The relationships Ohlone people sustain with missions remap these mission sites. Tonawanda Seneca scholar Mishana Goman explains remapping as a theory and practice for understanding the dynamic ways in which Indigenous peoples are in relationship to place, both historically and in the present day. She writes, quote, "Remapping is not just about regaining that which was lost and returning it to an original or pure point in history, but instead understanding the process that has defined our current spatialities in order to sustain vibrant native futures," end quote. The here points to the ways that Indigenous peoples, quote, "employ traditional and new tribal stories as a means of continuation," end quote, in narrating Indigenous relations to land. Such a move is a direct refusal of the ways colonization organizes bodies, lands, and political landscapes that situate Indigenous peoples in the past. Through narratives of survival, museum displays, protests, and other means, Ohlone peoples remap missions as Indigenous places. And we can see this by looking at relationships sustained to Mission Dolores. Next slide. Mission Dolores was founded in June 1776 near the Chukchui village of the Ramaytush Ohlone-speaking Yalamu tribe. The mission generated a community of distinct tribes comprising of diverse Ohlone speakers, Ramaytush, Chochenyo, and Tamian speakers, Coast Miwok, Bay Miwok, Wapo, and Patwin speakers, sometimes collectively called Doloreños. I was invited to join a tour of the mission in August 2019 by curator Andrew Galvin, who is Chochenyo Ohlone, Bay Miwok, and Plains Miwok. He explained that this is not a Catholic mission or a Spanish mission, but, quote, "an Indian mission built by Indians," end quote. Next slide. As we sat in the old mission church, he invited us to look upwards at the ceiling, painted by Ohlone artisans in the late 18th century in a traditional California Indian basket weave pattern. Andrew told us we were sitting in the very room where in 1794, his great-great-great-grandfather, Pelejma, a Bay Miwok man, was baptized. Pelejma took the name Faustino at baptism. Towards the end of the tour, we were invited to look through the Mission Museum, which includes a diorama of the Chukchui village, examples of regalia, and books by and about California Indians. Next slide. On February 2004, Andrew became the first descendant of a California mission in charge of interpretation at a California mission as curator of Mission Dolores. A large ceremony welcomed Andrew as curator, with historians, anthropologists, and other academics. During my interview with him, Andrew mentioned receiving a letter from a Franciscan classmate before the ceremony that encapsulated the meaning of the mission for him. He explained, quote, "He pulled it all together. Bishop Wester had me turn around and face the crowd in the sanctuary, and he asked everyone, 'Extend your hand, we're gonna do a blessing on Andy.' I was kind of looking up at the choir loft, and it was almost as if I could see Junipero Serra, Francisco Palau, and I was thinking of the California mission historians, Maynard Geiger, who I knew, Zaphram Engelhard, all the great mission historians. And then I could see all the Indians behind me, all like this, and it felt fantastic, warm and fuzzy. And I mean, there was great expectations, okay? I didn't know what the hell I was going to do, but it was a magic moment, and that for me is my connection to this place," end quote. The depths of these relationships were tangible both in my interview with him and in the talk he gave within the mission church, which was both critical of the violence Native people experienced and also a defense of Sarah's sainthood. Andrew has attracted controversy as a central figure in the canonization of Junipero Serra. Andrew and his family continue to utilize the mission space. Andrew's cousin, Vincent Medina, who is Chochenyo Ohlone, told me that Mission Dolores is where he had his first communion and confirmation. He later served as assistant museum curator. In June 2009, Amaya Fabrio Irwin, 10 generations after her ancestors Pelejma, who's Bay Miwok, and Jok Mokme, who is Ohlone, to whom Vincent and Andrew are related, was baptized in that same mission space. The baptism was preceded by a mass celebrating the 233rd birthday of San Francisco, followed by a procession to the cemetery, where grave markers for Palejma and Jokmokbe were erected earlier that week. These grave markers, a project Andrew initiated, are the only grave markers for the more than 6,000 Indigenous people buried at Mission Dolores. In his blog, Vincent wrote how this site has also served as a place of cultural revitalization. Quote, language classes at Mission Dolores are now a reality. Who would have thought the places that tried to take our language would shift to attempting to bring them back? And it will only get better. The mission remains an important site for other Ohlone tribes. Next slide. The cover story for the December 6, 2002 edition of the Catholic San Francisco describes an ancestral honoring ceremony conducted by members of the Costanoan Rumsen Carmel tribe in the Old Mission Church. The article reports that 191 years after the baptism of Chief Shumu and his wife at Mission Dolores, the fifth-generation great-grandson of the couple, Chairman Tony Serta, and members of the Costanoan Rumsen Carmel tribe offered prayers and dances for their ancestors. Tony was given the baptismal records of his ancestors, a piece of adobe brick made by his ancestors, and the title of Alcalde de Comunidad, Mayor of Mission Dolores. In an interview with Janet Klinger, Tony explains, quote, we did a crossover ceremony in full regalia in Mission Dolores in San Francisco in 2002 for the spirits of our ancestors who had died and were buried in a Christian way, but never had an Indigenous ceremony done. We had state senators there, the pastor, Brother Garrick, who told me that there are 5,000 Indians buried in the parking lot over there. We did a crossover ceremony at San Juan Bautista II the year after, end quote. Next slide. The ceremony suggests that Mission Dolores continues to be a site of meeting between the seen and the unseen world as both a church and a cemetery. In a similar way to Andrew's language about the missions as Indigenous places, Tony also asserts a belonging to that place. Today, members of the Association of Ramaytush Ohlone, the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, the Confederated Villages of Lishan Lashoni, and Himren Ohlone also voice ancestral ties to this mission. In my interviews, Ohlone peoples emphasize the importance of missions as burial sites, as cemeteries for their ancestors. These are places where some mention they feel the presence of their ancestors and have a responsibility to pay respects for their dead. Others talked about regular tribal gatherings at the missions. The examples provided suggest important moves towards remapping California missions. The cemeteries, burial grounds, prayers, tribal gatherings, and to varying degrees, museum displays make visible diverse Ohlone tribes to the missions, historically and in the present day. Remapping contests the settler narrative and pushed for a more expansive understanding that considers Indigenous life before and after the mission. These stories, these gatherings, remap the missions as sites of cultural history. When I spoke with Andrew Galvin, next slide, he voiced this attitude in relation to the missions as sites of survival, recounting a meeting with a woman whose ancestors were baptized at Mission Dolores. Galvin noticed she was touching the walls of the old mission when he walked in and asked why. Quote, she says, well, it has to do with my husband. His great-grandparents were in concentration camps during the Second World War at Dashu. You know, we went there on a trip with his grandparents because they wanted to see where the older generations had been. We were there just a couple of years ago, and when we got there, my husband's grandmother went over to the walls of the incinerator. We got to go there where they would burn the people. Well, I asked his grandmother, just like you're asking me now, what were you thinking when you were touching the wall, the incinerator? The lady turned to her grandson and said, my family survived this place. I was just thinking about my Indian ancestors who were here. We survived this place. Such narratives suggest that while the missions are indeed sites of profound violence and death, they are also places that people have survived, where connections continue. The various relationships descendants sustain with the missions also point to the fact that despite impossible odds, Ohlone peoples are still here. Their relationships to their lands and communities continue on. For many non-Ohlone people living in Ohlone territories, and similarly, among those living in areas of other kinds of Christian missionization, considering such remapping comes with an ethical imperative to think about our own relationships to the land we call home, and to engage in respectful relationships with the Indigenous peoples of that place. Thank you.
This presentation before lunch is by Alexi Sagona and Annalise Taylor, entitled Revitalizing Reciprocal Relations with Land, Amamutsun Pathways to Reconnection.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's great to be here. Mishmin Trihis Kanrakat Alexi Tomoy. My name is Alexi. Good afternoon. I'm from the village of Tomoy, among others, and I'm a member of the Amamutsun Tribal Band, which is in the Central California area, descendants of Mission San Juan Bautista and Mission Santa Cruz.
Thank you. I'm Annie Taylor. I go by Annie. Sorry about the long name. And I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley with Alexi, and I also grew up in the town over. So I grew up on Amamutsun Homelands and Ramitish Homelands. So I'm honored to be here to get to talk with you all. So I'll just be briefly introducing our project together, and some of you heard about that a few months ago in Santa Cruz, so we'll keep it brief. So over the past few years, Alexi and I have been building this interdisciplinary project where we're both working with the Amamutsun Tribal Band and the Amamutsun Land Trust, and leading the parts of this project that really fit well with our skills and interests, and that also meet needs of the tribe. So I'm a non-native researcher, and I've been extremely privileged to get to work with and collaborate with the tribe. So I just want to express that gratitude off the bat. And the work that we'll be talking about today aims to study both the social and ecological legacies of the mission system through the relationships between Amamutsun people and those homelands. So I think we've heard from many folks here today and yesterday that the issues of Indigenous erasure and dispossession can't be separated from issues of environmental and ecological degradation. So our work is really therefore trying to study these two pieces together, the cultural and the ecological. So today we'll be starting with chatting about our interviews with tribal members, which is really the foundation of our research and a big part of our CMS project. We'll also highlight our efforts to use community-based and participatory methods. We think that's very important to share. And so over the past year, we conducted 12 interviews with tribal elders and other cultural practitioners in the tribe, and most of these took place on Zoom. It's encouraging, or it's supportive to hear that other folks in this program hit similar challenges and that we're able to adapt. These conversations, even the virtual ones, allowed us to build deeper relationships with tribal members and also hear diverse perspectives about the missions and Amamutsun homelands. With support from the Critical Mission Studies program, we were able to provide honoraria to all of our interviewees, which is a part of showing respect for their time and contribution. And we were also able to provide little small gift boxes with culturally relevant gifts, including things like mugwort and lavender and salmon. So we're really grateful for the opportunity to do that and deepen those relationships in that way. And so these stories and ideas, which you'll hear about soon, directly shaped our research question and methods. And this has allowed us to start our research in a way that's relevant and useful, at least to some part of the community. It's also expanded our accountability beyond the tribal council, who we've worked to gain consent for this research. So now we have more relationships, more people to check in with and be accountable to in the community. So those are some of the ways that it's been really valuable. And I'll pass it off to Alexi to talk about some of his findings.
Yeah, that'll be great. Thank you, Annie. If we can get to the next slide, please. Perfect. And just to start off, we really wanted to center desire-based frameworks, and this is, coming from Eve Tuck's letter, Suspending Damage, which calls folks to move away from damage-based frameworks to desire-based ones. And so that's really why we were, so interested in building relationships with folks in the contemporary period and looking at the issues facing community members today, not just within, our small group of 12 interview participants, but, the broader community as well. And so, our colleagues here, many people on these panels have made rich contributions to Indigenous histories of the missions, and we would just want to complement that through our efforts to support the obstacles faced by members today. Next slide, please. So for many indigenous communities affected by Spanish missions, land dispossession has played a major role in severing human land relationships. Today, there are several dozen landless nations in California, and generations of displacement due to dispossession has involved what Indigenous legal studies scholar Sherry Pasternak describes as a slow form of violence. That removal over generations, elicits that slow form of violence. And so to account for these desire-based frameworks being in the contemporary, our work centers the opportunities for Ama Mutsun tribal band to engage in reciprocal relationships with land, to reconnect with homelands. Specifically, we use concepts of access to better understand reciprocal relationships, as well as Robin Rahl Kimmerer's definition or concept of reciprocal restoration, which is the mutual process of restoring land and culture by returning to land. So we define access as the ability to benefit from things. This is, thinking about property rights as being a bundle of sticks. Access is one of those sticks. And we also heed the call by Sybil Diver and other colleagues who urge us to look at the reciprocal relationships when thinking about access to natural and cultural resources. It's not just, a one-way street. It's reciprocal. It's two-sided relationships between humans and non-human. And we found this to be useful because the binary of possession versus dispossession does not tell the whole story about indigenous relationships, given that many tribes today continue to assert their sovereignty to land regardless of ownership arrangements. So for the Ama Mutsun tribal band, we own no land in our landless nation, but we assert authority over our ancestral homelands and always always have the obligation to care for it, and also have access to 30,000 acres of natural lands through these access agreements. So we look at how mission-era colonization has led to limited access to reciprocal relationships with land and the non-human. So next slide, please. And I just wanted to quickly summarize 3 of our key findings, and we don't have much time, so the first one is erasure. So one participant described conducting land stewardship on Ama Mutsun land that was held by private landowners as being difficult because some landowners were the descendants of the same families who stole the land from the tribe, and that they themselves cannot afford to live in their homelands as well. So one effect of Ama Mutsun dispossession is not physically being able to live on ancestral lands, which clearly has implications for how people think about Native people in contemporary times if you can't even connect to your lands and live there and afford to live there. And another participant shared a story of gathering acorns on a public preserve while a park docent tour was occurring. They overheard the docent describing Native American practices as being in the past, and they themselves were simultaneously out there gathering traditional foods with their kids. And this participant understood this mentality out there of there being no natives as stemming from the tribe not having a place to come together and to educate the public. So landlessness can also lead to people thinking natives are in the past. Another participant understood colonization as taking away opportunities to connect to land and to fulfill cultural responsibilities, and that has caused intergenerational trauma in the community today. So not only does this erasure occur in relation to settlers thinking about Native people, but it also can be an internal erasure where tribal members cannot practice their culture and have intergenerational trauma. This erasure is also tied to ecological degradation, which is our second theme. So in one Zoom interview, many of these interviews were via Zoom for the safety of our participants, someone conveyed how they understood introduced species, non-native introduced species, as being like a disease similar to the diseases introduced in colonization that decimated native populations. Another participant explained how basketry plants need to be regularly tended for many years to be usable, and how access limitations make this process incredibly difficult. They understood having sustained access to land as being important to carry on the tradition of basketry. So the decimation of the ecosystem, as well as exclusion from ancestral lands, are both barriers to engage in these reciprocal relationships between the land and the tribe. Our final theme is around tribal members having to navigate contemporary Western property logics. So in one interview, a participant discussed how land ownership does not align with Ama Mutsun cultural values, just like many indigenous cultures don't think you can own your ancestral land. However, owning land would be helpful for the community, and there could be opportunities for more relationships with land instead of enforcing the concept of ownership over other human kin. So thought of it as kind of like working within the system but changing it. Another participant discussed how an access agreement with a local agency required having to ask permission every time they wanted to access the preserve, and how they mentioned, our ancestors didn't have to do this, why should we? So this highlights the different concepts of authority within human land relationships. So for government land, the permission is needed from land managers in like a Western property scheme. But for Amamutsun, permission comes from the non-human and is derived from a relationship to place. So this isn't about asking permission from the federal government. This is about asking permission to that plant relative if you're going to harvest it. Two other perspectives I wanted to add before we get on to Annie included the need for ownership to hold ceremony in private without having to worry about members of the public coming into the space, as well as the symbolic importance of having communal land returned to the tribe, just as a place for people to be for healing and stewardship opportunities. And so just to wrap up, as the Amamutsun tribal band continues to grow their stewardship programs and partner with other landholding agencies and grow their access arrangements, the question of which forms of property rights are necessary to fulfill communal needs, whether it be access or ownership of other property rights, is of great significance. And yesterday we heard Professor Jonathan Cordero noting how owning land is not always feasible for under-resourced tribal communities. And so our hope is to support the needs identified by community members within the existing access arrangements today, given that it does take several $1 million just to maintain land in addition to actually acquiring it. So it's very, very cost inhibitive. So participants face significant barriers to accessing land and practicing culture, and these are all coming from the missions, right? And so it's kind of difficult to draw on like which part of colonization, whether it be the Spanish, the Mexican, or the American period led to this, dispossession. But a lot of people identified, the start of it being from the Spanish missions. So that's why, we're really hopeful to engage in community-based work and support these access agreements. So over the past few months, Annie and I have helped organize 2 community days involving 30 to 50 people, where these events brought people out onto sacred places, really important places, and included cultural leaders leading ethnobotany walks or doing harvesting of cultural materials. And so these events, literally help build that reciprocal relationship with community members and their ancestral lands. And so we really hope that we can continue supporting this access. And I'll pass it now to Annie to talk more about the mapping components of our project.
Wow, yeah, there's so much there, so I really appreciate you distilling it down for everybody. And just to speak to these community days, you can go to the next slide. I have learned so much at these days. So this is an acorn processing event, and I was really struck by it required our entire group to process just a small amount of acorn flour. So there's just a small part of the group there on the left, hard at work, and then maybe half of the flour that our group created together. And so that gives you a sense of just how collective and unifying these types of cultural days are, even for me as an outsider from the tribe. So really beautiful experience, but I also I had a window into some of the challenges that Alexi spoke to that tribal members faced and shared with us in those interviews. So one of them was, where are we going to go to get acorns? If you don't have the pre-existing knowledge of where to gather the tastiest acorns from trees that, maybe it's on private lands, where's public land where I can sneakily gather enough acorns for a big group of folks to collectively process and enjoy that cultural food. So that was a big challenge for me, and I know all of the mapping apps and all of the public plant databases, and so I really gained a respect for that barrier. And the legal barriers as well. Where are you legally allowed to gather? That can be a very small area for certain tribes. So this experience really clarified my work with the tribe to model and map accessible gathering locations for all of their cultural plants. So if you go to the next slide, I just have to check my work here. Yeah. So our goals are really twofold. First, to generate maps that can guide tribal members towards possible gathering areas, and second, to generate localized recommendations for the stewardship of these areas that can be shared with, in many cases, the land management agencies that still own those lands. And both of these pieces are key. Alexi spoke to this, but we can't revitalize foodways without revitalizing both access and stewardship. So a lot of the acorns that I found, had bugs in them. And if the Amamutsan were able to culturally burn some of these areas, that would support a more robust and healthy crop of acorns. So really these two pieces are key, both the accessibility and the stewardship. And that's what we're working towards. And then again, to break down the legal barriers. So if we can identify these gathering places, can we ask for legal access ASAP? So with the permission of the chairman who you met this morning, I'm going to show you an example of what this process, the mapping process, would look like for black oak. So you can go to the next slide. So black oak, this gorgeous tree here, it produces nutritious and delicious acorns that are central to Mutsun foodways. So in this process called distribution modeling, what we do is we layer all of the climate and environmental data that we think could be important for predicting where this tree would live, where it would thrive. So I'll just show two maps if you do 2 slides forward. This is precipitation and elevation in this general broad area where we might find black oaks in Mutsun homelands. And so you can see this is sort of an example of what these layers look like. And then on top of that, we can layer all of the known locations of black oaks. So if you go to the next slide, those orange dots are known locations of black oaks, and that's both from the tribe's private database and then public databases, which I mentioned earlier. And so we're running a bunch of different models to then say, okay, you've got all this data, all these environmental layers, and this is where they're found. Where else is similar? Where else might we find them? And that's what's shown in that dark green color. And this is where it gets really exciting. So these are places where we might find lots of black oaks or thriving, healthy populations of black oaks. So if you go to the next slide, the theory is then that we can compare these places, those dark green hotspots of black oaks, to places where the tribe does have gathering access today, and then zoom in and say, where are the trails? You know, where should we go? Where can we guide tribal members for legal and accessible gathering of this really central food plant? So if you go to the next slide, the idea is then to do this for all of the cultural plants. And obviously I have permission to share that, but this is all going to be a confidential internal resource for the tribe. So if we can locate areas, you could imagine all those dark green areas for all of the cultural plants. We could say, oh, this is a gathering hotspot for maybe 10 different cultural plants, and this is a place we need to fight hard for legal access. We need to fight hard for restoration of stewardship. Those types of prioritizations are possible. So this slide, I think, is just to give you an example of other mapping projects that we're working on with the tribe. So we're really trying to find ways to leverage these tools to answer, many different questions present right now in the tribe. And I just want to acknowledge, it's always critical to acknowledge that these mapping tools, these GIS tools, have military and colonial origins. And so it's a high priority of mine to figure out how I remain accountable to the Amamutsan community, to my collaborators, to the tribal council. And so we're really co-designing that together, learning how to create that accountability and that data sovereignty within the tribe. And so key to that is the GIS or mapping training, which I think is on this slide as well. And I'm really excited to get started doing that. And lastly, on the mapping piece, I just want to say Alexi connects me with all these awesome scientists and social scientists. And we talked about Indigenous philosopher Kyle White, who mentions that traditional ecological knowledges, like the locations of gathering places, these are situated knowledges, so they cannot be reapplied out of cultural context. So the tribe, again, owns and has exclusive access to these maps for that reason, because Mutsun culture is what gives the maps life and meaning. So for that reason, it's really critical we want to keep building on our community-based methods so that our research can continue to grow from and within that cultural context and not be reapplied externally. So with that, I'm just going to go to my last slide to say thank you to everyone. Thank you to the Critical Mission Studies program for supporting our work. You made it possible to show our gratitude to the community and build those relationships. We want to definitely express deep gratitude to the Amamutsan Tribal Band, the chairman's here, and the Amamutsan Land Trust. They're such supportive collaborators, and we really don't take your trust for granted. And our work wouldn't be possible without the trust and vulnerability of our interview participants. And then Alexi did a lot of exploring of archival materials at the Bancroft Library. And then also just to thank all of the wonderful people and friends who've supported our work so far. So thanks so much.
Everyone here and say that it was very illuminating and we all learned so much. I don't know how everyone feels. It's about 12:30, which is the lunchtime, but I don't know if there's some pressing questions that anyone wants to ask. Then we can maybe have like 1 or 2 questions, or we can just have a working lunch and you can ask the panelists your questions then. Does anyone feel strongly either way? Do you have a question?
Yeah, I guess for everybody, but especially the Rincon storyteller, so much of what you worked on, incredible, and so much of it not shared before. How did you handle any concerns or pushback, or what are you prepared for? And you addressed that you were only going to share certain things with the tribe, but you guys want to put it out, which I think is amazing. But what are you prepared for?
We're prepared for anything. We're actually currently in a little bit of a tussle with our school district already, because our Native children get suspended and they get random searches at higher rates than any other race on our campuses. And so as an education center, we started like a coalition of other education centers who are speaking up against that, and we have had pushback, and we already know what they want from us and what they don't want, because as a storytelling group we're invited to do California Indian Day celebrations, but we're not allowed on campus to tutor our students or help them out with club.
Or tell them the truth.
Yeah, or tell them the truth about the history that they should be learning. Because when we did have club, we were sharing this information with our students. We were sharing about the missions and how Native American citizens didn't have citizenship until 1926, which is something that Anthony and I didn't even learn until our junior year of high school at that school. So we're kind of already dealing with that, like the pushback and stuff, but it's not going to slow us down or anything. We're just going to add it to our to-do list that we got going on.
In terms of the angle of what one of the challenges we have at San Luis Rey is, oh, you're not supposed to say that, or you're not supposed to share that. And you guys have always been the lead, at the forefront. We're going to start sharing. And that's been a big consideration for us.
I think too, as Priscilla's talking about the work that we do in the schools, which that's where we're starting to tell the truth. We recognize that in order to heal, we don't want our young people waiting till college anymore to be angered or to be, motivated. We want our children to have the support around them and hear this information at an earlier age, so that when they get there, they're ready to go. But inside of our own community, yes, there's people who say these places and spaces and these names are just for us. And I recognize that, and I give it honor, but I think if you do work in a good way, and I feel like our group does really well at listening to the Creator and where He is taking us, and what we feel that He's telling us is that our children need this information to heal and to feel less impacts of trauma, and that outweighs what maybe we were able to do a long time ago, which was keep the information to ourselves. And that this time for us, everyone's saying how this is our time, right? The Native and Indigenous people, and we're moving forward and bringing our people forward, and sometimes it's uncomfortable. But we just try to do it in a good way. And I think being able to articulate that to our elders and people who still feel that we need to keep things to ourselves is really important. And to see us moving in a good way.
We can't thank you enough.
And I think too, like there's conversations we have had about, for example, Priscilla and Anthony found over 100 place names by going through the archival resources. Not all of that is going to go on the public website. That will stay at the education center, particularly sites that might be ceremonial or have a spiritual component. But some of the information we can share, we can be kind of, we can tell people in this area, and that's why we haven't done a lot of the specific like GIS pinned maps too, because we need to have those conversations internally about, do we want to mark for the education center on the reservation where this site is, but we also need to be careful about how detailed that map is for the outside. We could just say this area generally is a ceremonial site. We don't, just so we don't attract negative attention to it.
Yes, so we're still protecting, but it's again about our young people. So like the larger, like did you know Oceanside, Encinitas, and Escondido, like places you frequent all the time, they have original names, right? And those are your people's blah, 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 right? So things like that.
Yeah, and we were just talking this morning about translating some of the names, and that'll be a conversation process. But a name that we were talking about this morning, which means place of little roses, that would be a beautiful thing for people to learn. And so there's a lot more cultural context to it, but that will be for the kids in the community. But outsiders can learn that there's always been roses in that place.
Any other questions?
Or do you all want to respond?
Okay, well, I guess that wraps this panel up. So thank you all again for coming and for the presenters.